research that is related to the book that I'm currently writing about asylum over a very long period of history, and this represents a particular kind of episode that I've increasingly come to think as being very important in the development of asylum, and particularly the closing of asylum in the early 20th century. This piece is relatively, I think I said raw when I was talking to you earlier, Stephanie. It's the first time I've tried to pull together something on this particular organization, the Foreign Jews Protection Committee, which I happened across in the Manchester Central Library, which holds the minute book for the local chapter based in Manchester. And I told Fabrice about this a few years ago. I don't know if you'll remember this. And you asked me what I was doing with it. And my answer was, well, not much, not yet. So this is the sort of first attempt to try to pull that together with some other sources that I found across London and Warwick and Leeds and places across England. So I'll just go ahead and begin then. On the 25th of March, 1917, a few weeks after the outbreak of the Russian Revolution and the abdication of the Tsar, Lord Sheffield, a liberal peer and prominent education reformer, addressed a large public meeting at Camperdown House in London's East End. Called together by the Foreign Jews Protection Committee Against Deportation and Compulsion, to give it its full name, or FJPC, as I'll refer to it through most of this paper, the meeting featured prominent radical speakers like the Liberal MP Joseph King and the suffragette campaigner Sylvia Pankhurst. Letters were also read out from figures ranging from Israel Zangwill, the author of The Children of the Ghetto, Bernard Langdon Davis, Secretary of the National Council for Civil Liberties, local trade union and London Labour Party leaders, and Moses Gaster, the Romanian-born chief rabbi of the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue of London, which was and is the oldest continuously operating synagogue in the UK. Sheffield, after giving an optimistic appraisal of events in Russia, a country that he said was now fully united at home and firmly on the side of the liberal Western powers in the war, predicted that the glorious news from Russia would make the task of those who were fighting for the right of asylum easier and would make those who were false to the traditions of English freedom more ready to abandon their position. This is a poster that was posted around the East End advertising the meeting. You can see Sheffield's name is very prominently displayed here. You can also see Ms. Pankhurst, Joseph King, who I mentioned, several members of the Foreign Jews Protection Committee, Executive Committee. And this was posted around in both English and Yiddish. The tradition of English freedom to which Sheffield referred was the right of asylum, a vindication of which was passed as the first resolution of the Camperdown House meeting. Although the term the right of asylum, of course, has wide usage and was a concept with a very long international history and history of international legal theory, it had a particular salience in the political culture of the United Kingdom in the early 20th century. For at least a century, there had been a prevailing notion that the pillars of Britain's constitution, from Magna Carta through the Habeas Corpus Act, through the legal decisions that abolished slavery in the 18th century, all collectively guaranteed political and religious asylum to every individual who was physically present on British shores. I've written an article about the intellectual origins of this idea in the early 19th century, and I think you can see it as a very, very strong facet of British political discourse throughout the Victorian period. It was also held that this right to asylum for every individual who made their way to Britain was as important to English freedom on the whole, as Sheffield put it, as a free press was, or trial by jury. So that's the sort of theoretical background. More concretely, Britain's Extradition Act of 1870 had forbidden the extradition of political offenders to any foreign nation, and the category of political offender was deliberately kept vague in the legislation so that it could be interpreted as widely as possible. Moreover, the 1905 Aliens Act, which is famous for placing limits on economic immigration into Britain, had a clause that guaranteed the right of political and religious refugees to enter the country. Now, the question, of course, immediately arose of how one defines who a political or religious refugee was. In practice, the Liberal government that was in place for the entirety of the Aliens Act existence between its passage in 1905 and coming into force in 1906 and the outbreak of the First World War told the newly established immigration officers in Britain's ports to simply take claimed refugees at their word. If someone came and said that they were fleeing from religious or political repression, that they should be let into the country. So the right of asylum, in the context that Sheffield was discussing, was therefore held to be a peculiarly British institution, and one that, in theory at least, applied universally to everyone in the country, whatever their national origins or their political or religious opinions. With that consensus, which was already coming under strain by the early decades of the 20th century, was upended by the outbreak of the First World War. In response to the emergency of August 1914, the Liberal government of Herbert Asquith passed an Aliens Restriction Act, which, among other things, curtailed foreign nationals' movements into, within, and also crucially out of Britain. You needed a permit if you wanted to leave the country. Entry was controlled. You had to stay within 5 miles of your registered domicile, these sorts of restrictions. And the Home Secretary, at that time a man named Herbert Samuel, had the power under the Act to deport any alien who was deemed to be a threat to national security. At the same time, a Defense of the Realm Act, which was passed in August 1914, that gave the government summary power to suppress a wide array of activities. They could shut down newspapers, shut down clubs, ban meetings, things of that sort, and the power to detain individuals, British or foreign, for similar reasons of national security. One result of these two acts coming onto the statute books in late 1914, which is increasingly well known now, thanks to the work of historians like Panagi, was the mass incarceration of resident civilians of German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Bulgarian nationality. Probably 30,000 in all were interned, mostly on the Isle of Man, in a couple of camps on that island. And as the war went on, tens of thousands more were deported, and that system of deportation continued after the war came to an end. So here you have a photograph of Alexandra Palace, which is in North London, and was built in the late 19th century as a kind of attraction where concerts could happen and large-scale events, public events could take place, filled with German and Austrian internees. Earlier in the war, it had been filled up with Belgian refugees fleeing from the German invasion of that country in the autumn of 1914, but it was then in 1915 handed over to the Home Office for the internment of civilians. You also have on the left there an Aliens Restriction Order in Council. The Aliens Restriction Act gave the Home Secretary, gave the government the power to continue to give itself power to restrict activities. So orders in council could be issued to deal with whatever might emerge over the course of the war. It's an incredible concentration of power in the hands of the executive. So for those who had come to Britain to escape from the Kaiserreich or from the Habsburg monarchy, requesting an exemption from detention by citing the right of asylum tended to have little effect. In the most recent article that I've written on the family of the German anarchist Rudolf Rocker and his Russian Jewish partner Millie Whitkop, focuses on this aspect of detention, and Rocker protested that he had been an enemy of the imperial government in Germany for decades, and it cited the right of asylum in his request to be released, but these were ignored by the British government, and he was eventually deported. So, while wartime Britain is often remembered for accepting around 250,000 Belgian refugees fleeing from the German armies in the autumn of 1914, it was also at the same time a society that sharply curtailed the asylum previously offered to those who are now deemed enemy aliens. That's the language used in this legislation. On top of this, the demands for manpower amongst Britain's allies meant that friendly aliens were often deported to serve at the front. That included recently arrived Belgian refugees. It included nationals of France, of Italy. Though in the case of France, the British government quietly decided to leave undisturbed several French monasteries that had been founded by religious orders that sought refuge from the Third Republic's drive towards laïcité in the first decade of the 20th century. So there's a monastery on the Isle of Wight, and some monks wrote to the Home Office and said they would not go and fight for the Third Republic, and the British government thought, well, there's not that many of them, we'll sort of just leave them there. But the largest body of such friendly aliens in Britain were Russian nationals. I'll use the term Russian nationals throughout this paper, but this will include anyone who was technically a subject of the Russian Empire, which of course included Poles, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Estonians, Latvians, and many, many others. According to the 1911 census, the last one taken before the First World War, there were around 103,000 Russians and Poles, as the census put it, in England and Wales. 63,000 of these lived in London, disproportionately concentrated in the East End, Stepney, Whitechapel, neighborhoods like that. And out of this population, there was an estimated 25 to 30,000 men of military age, which in British law was defined as 18 to 41. Most of these Russians and Poles, it's hard to say exactly how many, but almost certainly the vast majority, were Jewish migrants who over the past 25 years had fled from pogroms, from economic, social, and political restrictions, and from the onerous terms of military conscription that were put upon them by the Tsarist state. Hostility to the Russian government was therefore very widespread in this population, and for the first 2 years of the war, there were no plans to send anyone from Britain to fight on the Eastern Front, even if they were of Russian nationality. That situation, however, was transformed when Britain, which did not begin the war with a conscript army, unlike the other major combatants, adopted conscription for its own nationals at the beginning of 1916. So, over the course of 1916, as British men were called to the front, there was increasing resentment, voiced particularly in anti-immigrant newspapers like the East London Observer, that a large, concentrated, and therefore very visible population of foreigners remained safe at home, while British Tommies are being sent to the Western Front. There were a number of riots in London and in Leeds and other places with large Russian Jewish populations, and the British government began to worry about civil disorder as a result of this anomaly. So, in a Commons debate on the 29th of June, 1916, the Home Secretary, Herbert Samuel, suggested that if Russian nationals could not be convinced somehow to join the British army, that they should be sent forcibly to Russia to fight in the Russian army. So Samuel's comments immediately set off a backlash. Sheffield and others quickly denounced what he said in Parliament. And amongst Britain's Russian-born population, grassroots organizations sprang up to combat repatriation. These included groups like the Russian Anti-Conscription League and the Committee of Delegates of Russian Socialist Groups in London. All of these organizations have very long and cumbersome names, which are not very easy to reduce to acronyms. The delegates of Russian socialist groups were led by the émigré and future Soviet Foreign Commissar Georgy Chicherin, and by the radical school reformer Mary Bridges Adams, who also appeared at some Foreign Jews Protection Committee events. and meetings. The Foreign Jews Protection Committee was probably the largest and most long-lasting of these organizations to spring up in the summer of 1916. And here you can see an array of literature that is produced in this period. On the right, your right and mine, you have an appeal to public opinion, should the Russian refugees be deported. This is a actually surprisingly dense and lengthy pamphlet that describes in great detail the civil disabilities that Jews in Russia suffer under, the persecution of intellectual life in Russia, describes exile to Siberia, things of this nature, and ends with a plea for Britain to uphold its long-lasting tradition of asylum. In the middle there you can see a membership card from the Russian Anti-Conscription League. The reason that this has been saved is it's in the Home Office papers, and it is the membership card of a police spy who infiltrated this meeting and was asked when he arrived, "Are you a member?" And he said no, and he was asked if he wanted to sign up, so he did. Emerging in London in July 1916, the Foreign Jews Protection Committee counted amongst its affiliated organizations Jewish trade unions, Jewish social democratic organizations such as the Bund and Paulay Zion, friendly societies like the Workers' Circle, which existed all across Great Britain. It was relatively small, but it had circles, as they called them, across the major cities of Great Britain, as well as local anarchist organizations. In all, the FJPC claimed to represent 120 such organizations. In its first year of existence, its secretary was a man named Solly Abrahams, who took the alias Abraham Bezalel, named after the artisan figure in the Book of Exodus, who constructed the Ark of the Covenant. So there's reference to exile and the sort of Jewish tradition of exile there in the name that he took on. Bezalel, who was born in Romania, had come to Britain only in 1914 by way of France, and many of the FJPC's leadership were similarly recent arrivals, and they were thus, one might argue, most keenly aware of the continuing discrimination against the Jews of Eastern Europe, both in Russia and in Romania. And here we have a list. I'm sorry about all the sort of documents that are heavy in text. These are not wealthy organizations. They don't have the budget for sort of embroidered or pictorially rich sort of promotional literature. But this is a list of major members of the Executive Committee that the Foreign Jews Protection Committee handed over to the Home Office in response to a request for this. And if you can see the affiliates of the organizations that are listed here. There are many trade unions, radical organizations like the Bund, the Yiddish Anarchist Federation, things of this nature. On its foundation, the FJPC announced that its object was to befriend those refugees who, often ignorant of the language and customs of the country to which they have fled from injustice and persecution, were bewildered and helpless before this new threat of compulsion. Its very first action in July 1916 was therefore to send Samuel a petition claiming that deportation to Russia can, as they said, only be a violation of the right of asylum, which made Great Britain a nation honored above all others. And this appeal to the right of asylum and this kind of pre-war notion of the right of asylum, as I described at the beginning of this paper, was ubiquitous amongst those who opposed to Samuel's proposal to repatriate Russian nationals to fight on the Eastern Front. Sheffield and the Lords made reference to Britain's long history of accepting refugees, stretching back to the Huguenots of the 16th and 17th century, and an independent Jewish trade union deputation pleaded with Samuel, what political refugees have had grievances greater than ours? This charge that sending Russians back to Russia, particularly Russian Jews back to Russia, would violate the right of asylum was initially very hard for Samuel to answer, particularly since the Russian government was engaged in widespread pogroms and population removals early in the war, both in its own territory and in occupied Galicia. And a number of these organizations that opposed repatriation to Russia made comparisons to the Armenian massacres happening in the Ottoman Empire. They said you would not send Armenians back to Turkey in the aftermath of what happened in 1915. This is a comparable situation. So as such, the appeal to maintain the pre-war right of asylum was for a while successful in these very particular circumstances of Russian nationals who had emigrated from the Tsarist state, in a way that didn't hold for opponents of the Kaiserreich, opponents of the Third Republic, or any other major combatant power. However, the war's long duration and the related political changes that occurred in Russia in 1917 and after ultimately doomed this strategy of appealing to the pre-war right of asylum and forced the FJPC to change its tactics, focusing less on the principle of asylum itself and increasingly on practical material relief for Britain's refugee population, hence the subtitle of the paper that you saw on the very first slide. In this sense, the fortunes of the FJPC were indicative of wider and permanent shifts in Britain's approach to asylum that were set in motion by the First World War. Britain is never as open again to refugees after the First World War as it was in the century or so, 90 years or so before the First World War. Now, in the first year of its existence, the FJPC engaged in a broad array of what Britons in the 19th and early 20th century called the mass platform, a sort of series of related strategies pioneered by 19th century radicals like the Chartists, recently taken up by the suffragette movement. This included, as I've already mentioned, petitioning the government directly and cultivating relationships with sympathetic members of Parliament. I've mentioned Sheffield and Joseph King already, the radical liberal William Byles, and Philip Morrill, who was one of the founders of the Union of Democratic Control, a cross-party coalition critical of much of the government's war policy, were also very sympathetic to the FJPC and came to its meetings and raised questions for it in Parliament. Similarly, the committee supplied press briefings to Britain's newspapers. It held open-air meetings, as I've hinted at already, to garner publicity and support. It also made unflattering international comparisons to try to embarrass the British government into doing what it wanted. So Bezalel, for example, reached out to the French socialist deputy Marcel Moutet, with whom he had a conversation about the question of Russian Jews in France, and if France was contemplating a move similar to what Samuel seemed to be suggesting. And Moutet told him about how the French Parliament had voted not to send Russian Jews back to Russia, to leave its resident Russian population undisturbed. This population was smaller than that in Britain, and so the British government was unmoved, but Bezalel printed and distributed this conversation to sort of try to say, you can see France is upholding the right of asylum. It would be a shame if Britain didn't do the same itself. Let's skip that. So here you can see a breakdown of the revenue and the expenses of the Leeds branch of the Foreign Jews Protection Committee, which gives you a sense of the kind of activism that it engaged in this period between the middle of 1916 and the middle of 1917. So you can see on the right different sources of revenue, organizations and individuals giving money over to the cause. And on the left, you can see the main types of expenditure. And here it's printing and stationery, it's telegrams, it's posting letters and circulars. It's this kind of propaganda campaign to try to raise awareness of the issue and bring over a critical mass of British public opinion. So these efforts met with some modest measures of success, I think it's safe to argue. The FJPC's parliamentary allies consistently raised awkward questions and attempted to derail the case for deportation in parliamentary debates. If you look at the Home Office records from this period, you can see amongst ministers and civil servants a particular antipathy towards Joseph King, whose questions were anticipated with exasperation, and whom it was once said was acting under instructions from the FJPC. Its campaign, the FJPC's campaign, in general terms, was endorsed by elements of Britain's own anti-conscription movement, by suffragette associations, particularly those around Sylvia Pankhurst, by important bodies in the English labour movement, like the London Trades Council, and by the National Council for Civil Liberties, which I mentioned earlier, and which is today the lobbying body known simply as Liberty. Radical newspapers like The Call, The Herald, The Woman's Dreadnought consistently attacked the government for planning to abrogate the right of asylum. They followed the story very closely. They ran articles about it on a regular basis. But so too did more mainstream liberal newspapers like The Nation, The Daily News, and above all, the Manchester Guardian, which label the government's plans for repatriation a serious and illiberal error. And it printed letters to the editor from Russians, who usually remained anonymous. It printed its own leading articles denouncing the government's plans, and provided plenty of column space for the FJPC's cause. Perhaps more substantially than this, the FJPC won some victories in the courts against the state. The most famous example of this took place over the last months of 1916 and early 1917, and involved 4 Russian nationals who had secured permits from the British government to leave the country and go to Russia via Denmark. But when they got to Denmark, instead of boarding a ship for Archangel, they boarded a ship for the United States, a Danish ship flying under the neutral Danish flag. However, the British Navy, enforcing its blockade on Germany, brought that ship into a Scottish port to be inspected for military contraband, and the 4 men were pulled ashore and charged with making a false statement regarding their intent to go to Russia. So the FJPC challenged this on a number of fronts. They challenged the government's jurisdiction on this neutral ship for anything other than military hardware, initially claiming that it had been seized on the high seas and so was illegitimate altogether. They also threw doubt on the government's ability to establish the initial intentions that the 4 gentlemen had, the 4 defendants had. The case went through several rounds of appeal, but was eventually dismissed by the High Court, and the defendants were set free. It was quite a propaganda coup for the Foreign Jews Protection Committee. They printed up this pamphlet recording some of the sessions in the court, and also attached to this, sort of letters of support from prominent British political figures and intellectuals to show the widespread support for their cause. In another case, the FJPC and its allies successfully established that while the Aliens Restriction Act gave the Home Secretary the power to expel foreign nationals, there's no doubt about that, it did not empower him to specify a particular destination for aliens to be deported to. So he couldn't say, I'm deporting you from Britain, you must go to Russia, or you must go to France, or wherever else. Now, this clearly would complicate any scheme to try to send foreign nationals directly to Russia itself. So as this campaign was going on, the FJPC also grew in size. In London, affiliate bodies began to appear, often dedicated to very particular sort of aspects of the cause. So there was, for example, a small Russian, Jewish, French refugees committee, which was made up of Russian migrants that had been living in Belgium and France at the outbreak of the war, fled to Britain when the German invasion happened, found themselves there, sort of swept up in the Belgian exodus of late 1914. And they had a particular demand to be allowed to depart the UK and go wherever they would wish. And they said, every right-minded man will no doubt sympathize with this cause, seeing that our sojourn in this country is only accidental and temporary. One of the arguments that the opponents of the FJPC would throw back to claims, that repatriation would violate the right of asylum was, well, you've come to this country, you've gained from it, so you owe it something, either fighting for it directly or fighting for its allies. This particular body was able to say, well, we don't really want to be here in the first place. that works for them, not as well for the wider Russian Jewish population across the country. As I've already alluded to, branches are founded across Britain's major cities, usually in direct response to the publication of the initial open letter to Samuel by the London branch. Local branches seem to have operated relatively independently, as you could see from the spreadsheet of the Leeds branch. They're raising their own money, they're distributing their own propaganda locally. They have contacts with their own sort of regional newspapers, regional prominent figures to try to garner up support in Liverpool or Glasgow or wherever it happens to be. But there does seem to have been some national cohesion to the organization. It's a little difficult to tell, but you can, if you read through the branch minutes of Manchester, Leeds, or whatever, you can see these bodies explicitly affiliating to the London Committee, asking London for advice, for propaganda, for money, above all else. And representatives of the different branches sort of go back and forth between Britain's cities and try to hammer out some coherence to the national strategy of campaigning and to the propaganda that they issue. As the FJPC was expanding then, and as it was winning over at least a section of advanced British opinion, the government was continuing to try to square the circle of Russian military service. The British Army, therefore, was opened up to foreign national volunteers for the first time in the war, and a recruiting campaign was conducted by Zev Jabotinsky, who would later go on to found a Jewish legion that fought against the Ottomans in Palestine in 1917-1918. As an added incentive to try to get Russian nationals to sign up, the fees for naturalization were waived for anyone who had served in the British Army for at least 3 months. And you can see here the government's sort of leaflet that's sent out on the left, trying to convince people to sort of show up to have their medical tests taken to see if they'd be eligible for service in the British Army. You can see this Yiddish pamphlet here distributed by Jabotinsky and his allies to try to convince people in the East End, people in Manchester and Leeds to sign up for the British Army. This campaign was a pretty dismal failure, however. Only about 400 people signed up by the middle of October 1916. So although Samuel had said in the summer, well, let's see how this sort of volunteer campaign goes, in the end, it's clear that he has to return to some form of compulsion. The British government wouldn't unilaterally conscript Russian-born people into its army, however. It feared a backlash, an international backlash. It would be a breach of international norms. It technically violated a treaty dating back to 1859 that the British and Russian governments had signed with one another, and there was some fear in the British embassy in Petrograd that this would lead to reciprocal action on the part of the Russian government, and the British government would have no sort of recourse to try to pull its own citizens out of Russia if that were to happen. So London continued to try to negotiate with Petrograd, but this proceeded very slowly. The Russian ambassador explicitly told the Foreign Office that his country did not want political dissidents or Jews to return to the country and sow discord in the Russian army. He's worried about morale breaking in that instance. There were also logistical problems. Shipping was pretty scarce. The port of Archangel was closed effectively during the winter months. And so, actually getting men from Britain to Russia after the winter cold started to set in, sort of pushed back the negotiations. So too did the collapse of the Asquith government in December 1916. And you can, if you sort of read through the Home Office documents relevant to this subject, it's not until about February 1917 that the new Home Secretary, George Cave, is sort of fully appraised of what had been going on top of the brief, and ready to begin negotiations again. He did begin negotiations again in February, but just as a draft agreement was circulating between the two capitals, the February Revolution broke out, and the Tsarist regime collapsed. The Russian Revolution had an electrifying effect on the FJPC and its allies. as the celebratory mood of the Camperdown House meeting that I was referencing at the beginning of the paper demonstrates. However, the end of Tsarism and the declaration of equal rights for Jewish people in Russia greatly complicated the committee's argument that repatriation constituted a violation of the right of asylum. As the decidedly unsympathetic Daily Mail put it on the 7th of April 1917, there is no longer any reason why free Russians should not go to the aid of freed Russia. Bezalel, for one, seemed to sense this, and in response, I think you can see the FJPC's arguments shifting subtly and stiffening, if anything, in tone. So on the 10th of May, Bezalel sent out a circular to all of the FJPC's supporters and correspondents, where he made the argument that compulsion was unnecessary, since there was a stream of patriotic Russians who were now returning to shape the new regime, to shape the revolution. He argued that repatriation of men of military age without their families would be inhumane. And this is something that will grow in importance as the rest of the war kind of drags on. He warned that there were complications that were not being considered. What about Russian Poland, which has been overrun by Germany, which the provisional government is thinking about recognizing, which would be a neutral state, conceivably, if it did become independent. And he pointed out that his own Romania had had no similar revolution, and so the right of asylum had to be maintained for the thousands of foreign nationals in Britain who had been born in Romania. So there's a variety of ways in which he adapts the FJPC's message to the quick-moving events in Russia. However, as the spring turned into the summer, it emerged that the provisional government in Petrograd had, after some prodding from London, picked up negotiations on the matter of the Russian population in Britain, and was nearing an agreement with the UK. So you can see in the spring and the summer, the FJPC really steps up its campaigning, particularly its open-air campaigning, and there are several meetings with thousands of supporters that happen across the East End in sort of large music halls and other kind of amusement centers where the imminent Anglo-Russian military convention, as it was called, is denounced. And this gives you an example of one such meeting. Again, Sheffield is at the top there, and you'll recognize some of these names from the meeting that occurred in March. This is June 1917, and the list of demands are here just above the list of speakers. So protest against forcing foreigners into the British Army, just sort of focusing on that, focusing on Russian citizens being able to come back with their families intact, and sort of still sticking with the language of the right of asylum. You'll be surprised to hear that this campaign did not prevent the signing of an Anglo-Russian military convention, which was completed in July 1917, and gave Russian nationals in Great Britain until the 9th of August to indicate a preference for serving in the Russian army or the British army. They were given a form, and if they wanted to serve in the Russian army, they were told to tick the box, fill in their details, and arrangements would be made to send them to Russia. Anyone who did not actively take this step was deemed to be enlisted in the British Army by way of conscription from the 9th of August onwards, with the explicit approval of the Russian government, thus getting around the issue of the 1859 treaty, international law, international norms. So this new legal reality, which was approved by Parliament, combined with increasingly desperate tactics by Bezalel, who wrote straight to the Petrograd Soviet, trying to convince them to scupper the agreement, convinced the government to arrest several of the FJPC's leaders, citing the Defense of the Rome Act. As the Criminal Investigation Department's Basil Thompson put it in his diary on the 17th of July 1917, the convention was signed the other day by the provisional government, and Bezalel has founded a society for resisting this. If he were in Russia, he would be arrested, yet we have to submit to him stumping across the country in favor of peace. He will have a rude awakening tomorrow. Bezalel was arrested, was deported. He went to Petrograd, and then after the war, he popped up in Berlin, found a letter from his brother asking Moses Gaster, the chief rabbi of the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, for money to help sort of reunite the family. And he said that Abraham is in Berlin now, and he has a job, but the mark is worthless in Britain, so he can't bring us over with the money from it. However, the decapitation of the leadership of the FJPC did not destroy the organization. Indeed, some in the FJPC were not opposed to something like the military convention, so long as it was with a government other than the Tsars. So the Leeds branch, in August 1917, claimed that the last year of campaigning had been a success. They argued the work for which the committee was originally established, namely to oppose the conscription of Russian Jews, whilst the old despotic Russian government did not grant our brethren any rights of citizenship, that work, the glorious Russian Revolution, has brought to an end. In other words, we managed to delay the plans until the Tsarist government collapsed, and that is what we really wanted. However, the Leeds branch went on to say, the new convention has called forth new activities for us in the form of advising and assisting those who are affected by the convention. It gets a little complicated and confusing tracing the FJPC from here. Several of its branches changed names to reflect a shift away from kind of confronting the government on asylum itself and towards practical assistance for those caught up by the new arrangement between Britain and Russia. So in Leeds, the organization was changed its name was changed to the Russian Citizens Protection Committee. The main London committee renamed itself by the end of 1917 the United Russia Committee, but several branches kept the original name. So I'll just keep using FJPC as a shorthand to avoid confusion. So the assistance that was called forth, as the Leeds branch put it, was in the first instance legal advice. You can see in different branches across the country retaining the services of lawyers to help Russian nationals who were being called into the military tribunals that governed Britain's conscription system, that decided whether or not to grant exemptions based on, if you were a minister of religion or if you had some compelling family reason why your family depended on your income and would be ruined without you, as well as the sort of medical reasons why people were exempted from conscription. So it's the FJPC that represents a lot of Russian nationals called into the tribunals, and which also does a lot of translation work for those who speak nothing other than Yiddish, who don't understand English and can't really adequately represent themselves or respond to the missives of the military tribunals. But ultimately, the most important work that the FJPC and its successor bodies now dedicated themselves to after July-August 1917 was the material support of the families of men who chose to be repatriated to Russia rather than to be conscripted into the British Army. If you're conscripted into the British Army, the British government pays a sort of pension to wives and children. For those who chose to go back to Russia, and there are probably about 4,000 that did so between the summer of 1917 and when the Bolshevik Revolution broke out and sort of effectively ended the cooperation between the British and the Russian government on this. For those 4,000, the Russian government was supposed to foot the bill. But perhaps unsurprisingly, given the quick pace and chaotic pace of events in Russia, that aid was only irregularly ever paid. It was not forthcoming most of the time. And so the FJPC stepped in to pay for the families of these men who went overseas. So I said there are 4,000 who go to Russia. Probably about 2,000 have wives and children, some Russian-born, some British-born, but all initially promised relief or sustenance from the Russian government. So this entailed financing weekly payments of 12 shillings 6 pence for the wives of the men who started to be referred to as conventionals. They had gone to Russia under the terms of the military convention between those two states, and 2 shillings 6 for their children younger than 16. Not a princely sum, maybe enough to kind of keep a family together, however. On top of this, the London FJPC endeavored to provide free medical advice to these families, medicine directly, milk, coals to keep them warm in the winter, boots, and bovril, which, if you're not aware, is a uniquely British drink of beef extract, essentially, which was supposed to have very sort of sustaining qualities in the winter months. And by the time that the war came to an end, there was also a nursery planned, which did in fact open in 1919, for the young children of these families. This kind of constant expenditure required constant fundraising, and there are a variety of strategies that the FJPC employed in order to meet the bill. In both Manchester and in London, for example, there were picture shows put on at local cinemas, grand concerts, open-air meetings, things like that, dances, galas, things to try to bring ticket-buying audiences to bear. In 1919, there was a coordinated series of concerts in Manchester, Liverpool, and Leeds, which attracted performers, Jewish performers from around the world. Some came in from New York, others from Norway, to provide entertainment that people would be willing to pay for, and that large numbers of people would come to see. I think my favorite instance of this kind of creative fundraising was in 1917. The Manchester FJPC put on a variety show by a man named John Klempert, who was an escape artist, who had grown up in Siberia, moved to the United States, and was sued by Harry Houdini for stealing aspects of his act and hounded out of the United States, and made a career for himself in the UK. So here's a colorful display advertising John Klempert's amazing feats. The Siberian death defier, because he's from Siberia, and you can see a Union Jack and the Stars and Stripes showing where he's been. You can see him on a scaffold here at the bottom. Maybe I'm in the way, but he was called the man who cannot be hanged, because he managed to find his way out of various nooses. However, the windfalls from these kinds of events were no substitute for regular income. And for this, the FJPC increasingly turned to mainstream institutions of Jewish civil society. So the FJPC started to solicit synagogues. It issued urgent appeals around the time of holidays like Passover. It approached fraternal societies like B'nai B'rith, and it also appealed to the classic, fairly conservative pillar of the Jewish establishment, the Jewish Board of Guardians, which dated back to the 1850s and dispensed charitable relief in the decades thereafter. So here you can see an urgent appeal in Manchester, and you can also see a card sort of telling one of the women in receipt of relief from the FJPC where she should come to pick up where and when she should come to pick up her weekly allowance. In the process, some FJPC branches registered as official war charities, and it's very interesting now to look on the website of the Manchester Central Library, which holds the minute book of that branch. It's presented as a kind of patriotic, here's an example of the Jewish community doing its part for king and country kind of organization, when its founding membership was fairly radical and often quite anti-war, anti-establishment. So this is a page of the list of names of the main members of the committee in Manchester and the organizations that they represented. You can see at the very top there, anarchists. Second is the BSP, the British Socialist Party, and a number of local trade unions and things of that nature. So a different set of origins to the way that body is now remembered. This shift towards a more moderate or apolitical stance, doing business with these kinds of pillars of the establishment, was accelerated by another factor, which was that in early 1918, when it became clear that the Bolshevik government in Russia was either unable or unwilling to pay the pensions of the conventional families, Britain's local government board took over responsibility for them. So the FJPC found itself working more closely with the government to ensure that pensions were delivered to the right individuals, to try to bring worthy cases, people who were not being given pensions for one reason or another, to the attention of the government. And so in many ways, the FJPC had gone from resisting participation in the war effort outright to becoming an adjunct in relief payments for soldiers' families. It's quite a dramatic shift in actions and priorities. And that transition was too much for some of its members, and the organization started to splinter more and more in 1918. There was a breakaway group called the Ladies' Committee for Protecting the Interests of the Dependent Families of Russian Citizens. Again, another long name, which broke with the mainstream FJPC because of its acceptance of local government board funds. This new committee said that they considered it will be a degradation for the families to go to the guardians, and that they believe the local government board are aiming to place a trap for the Russians to utilize them for their vile purposes later on. They don't say what vile purposes they have in mind, but there's clearly an anti-state, anti-government sort of attitude here, which makes the kind of the shift towards more mainstream material relief unpalatable for some, at least when done in conjunction with mainstream institutions and the government. There were also a number of women who were in receipt of this relief who refused to collect their pensions on the premises of anyone other than the FJPC. So in Manchester, a group of women refused to go to the local Jewish Board of Guardians, saying that they would rather die than do so. I mean, there were famously tensions, to put it mildly, between new immigrants in the late 19th, early 20th century and the older Anglo-Jewish establishment. I can only think that this is a kind of result of some of those long-standing community tensions. You also have groups that are much more willing to work with the government. I found this organization, which is constantly in 1918 soliciting the state to start to take conventionals back into Britain after the war on the Eastern Front has come to an end. When the war came to an end, the London Committee of the FJPC estimated that it was supporting, either on its own or in conjunction with the local government board, 682 women and 1,173 children. So still seemingly most of the families, or a good chunk of the families that it had taken on responsibility for earlier. But unlike the families of British soldiers on the Western Front, these families could not expect the imminent return of the soldiers that had gone abroad. Indeed, Lloyd George's government, if anything, had become more hostile to immigration in the wake of the December 1918 khaki election, which produced a parliament that had a conservative majority, even though it kept Lloyd George's liberal conservative coalition in place. And it was that parliament that went on in 1919 to make essentially the Aliens Restriction Act permanent, so that there was no recourse for refugees as such to come into the country. The government initially refused to allow any of the men who had gone to Russia to come back, and eventually it did relent if a soldier in question could give definite proof that they had fought, in fact, for the Allied cause, which is something very difficult to come by in the increasingly chaotic circumstances that Eastern Europe is finding itself in as the war comes to an end, as the Russian Civil War gears up. So rectifying this sort of disallowance of the men who had gone abroad to come back was the main task that the FJPC took on for itself in the last stage of its existence. In 1920, it was folded into a wider Russian Dependence Committee, which brought it together a large number of charities that had been interested in this question. And in October that year, 1920, that committee estimated that only 20 men had been allowed to come back to the country out of the 4,000 that had gone abroad in the second half of 1917. They tried to impress upon the government the humanitarian case for letting men come back after they had done what had been asked of them, but now found themselves often kind of on the wrong end of a civil war. But they had more success in moving the government by making the argument that if you allow these men to come back, you can stop paying relief to their wives and children. There'll be breadwinners that will take their dependents off the books, as it was put. So over the course of 1921, 1922, the combination of pressure from the now rebranded Russian Dependence Committee and increasing awareness of the ferocity of the fighting in Russia did loosen the sort of government's position a little bit. By July 1922, when the committee was wound up finally, it estimated that 238 adults and 441 children had been taken off the books, as they put it, through their family members returning. So by far a minority of the cases, but still more than 20. And in those last couple of years, the Home Office worked very closely with the Russian Dependence Committee to vet the political suitability of the men wanting to come back. So you can see just in the sort of career of the FJPC, Britain has gone from a country that still in theory is committed to the sort of pre-war notion of the right of asylum to a country that is definitively closed to some, not just would-be immigrants, but people who had previously been granted asylum in the country based on their politics, based on their national origin. In many cases, Germans are deported and not allowed to come back. And I think it's indicative of this wider shift and this more restrictionist era of British immigration politics that was about to begin. Thank you very much.